This is corporate finance, and this is the reading on corporate governance and ESG. Notice that there are 5 readings under corporate finance. And before I get into this particular slide deck, what I want to do is give you a basic idea of how a business works, how a corporation works. And this is going to be a theme that I will emphasize during the next series of videos under corporate finance. These businesses usually get started by an individual or a group of individuals who have an idea about how to deliver a product or a service. Now, these individuals are extremely smart, and so they're aware that in order to deliver this product or service, they need to have some kind of asset in place in order to manufacture or distribute it or transport it or whatever the function is. And those assets can be machinery or pieces of equipment or a building or land or maybe even an airplane. And those individuals then have to ask themselves the question, okay, how are we going to pay for it? Maybe they pool their funds. Maybe they go down to the bank to get a loan. Maybe they issue a bond. Maybe they issue shares of stock to some of their friends or the investing public. So they raise all this capital so that they can invest in long-term assets. So I want you to think about the balance sheet. You have all these assets on the left-hand side, and you have all these liabilities and equity on the right-hand side. Now it's time to put the assets in place. And so this machinery, this piece of equipment, this land, this airplane, they start generating a product line. And that product line, of course, could be something as simple as a Q-tip or dog food or some kind of a computer software service or a light bulb or a microphone. And so what these individuals do inside of this business is that they start selling their product line. They generate revenues and they incur expenses, and what's left over is called operating cash flow. And these business owners then have 2 choices with that operating cash flow. They can either reinvest it back into the company or pay it out as a dividend to themselves or the owners of the business. And this is pretty much how a business works, even from a small donut shop that's locally owned all the way up to a large corporation like Procter & Gamble or McDonald's. And so I want you to think of corporate governance. This first LOS asks us to describe corporate governance. I want you to think of it as a system, ready? Internal controls, processes, and procedures by which the company is managed and directed and controlled. So all of those decisions, and let me go back here really quickly, those decisions we're going to talk about in each of these readings, all of those decisions represents this system of corporate governance. Corporate governance outlines the rights and roles and responsibilities of all the various persons within the organization. And so the goal of the business, ready? The goal of the business, you guys know this, is to maximize the value to the owners. The goal of corporate governance then is to promote the interests of all the stakeholders in a fair, transparent manner. So I want you to think about it this way. One way to maximize shareholder wealth is to have a fair and transparent corporate governance structure. Quick example, I urge you to go to the Johnson & Johnson webpage under its Principles of Corporate Governance. And they have a really cool setup. And you can actually view pictures and description of the board of directors. I believe Johnson & Johnson has 10 of them, 9 of which are independent. There's a description of the management team, so you can look at their pictures and you can look at their backgrounds and all their skills and all their talents. And so clearly, when you read about the board and you read about the management team, you'll be pretty confident that these men and women are pretty smart. They have good background, they have good training, and they're going to be able to deliver the Johnson & Johnson products like baby shampoo. One of the things I found most fascinating is there's a link on how to write a letter to the board of directors. And so if you buy Johnson & Johnson's baby shampoo, it says no more tears or whatever that commercial is, and you wash your baby's hair and your baby gets shampoo in his or her eyes and they start crying, you can write a letter to the board and say, hey, how is this possible? Let's take a look at the different stakeholder groups and compare the interests of stakeholder groups. Primary stakeholders include people like the shareholders, they're the owners. The creditors, this is the bankers who lend the firm capital, or bondholders or general creditors, managers and employees, suppliers, and then the board of directors. So those are the primary, what are those, 5 of them there? And then there's some others too, customers, governments, and regulators. Now let's talk about the conflicts that might arise between and among, let's go back real quick, between and among these primary stakeholders, because the goal of the shareholder might not be the same goal of the manager, which might not be the same goal of the board, which might not be the same goal as the creditors. Now, the relationship between and among all these different stakeholders can be summarized in this hypothesis called the agency theory. It describes the relationship between the principals and the agent. And so what happens is that in general, the principal hires the agent, and so the agent is then expected to act in the best interest of the principal. Involves obligations and trusts and expectations of loyalty. Of course, if you hire a contractor to come into your home and refinish your kitchen, you're going to expect high quality, you're going to expect due diligence, you're going to expect that the contractor knows something about carpentry and maybe something about plumbing, so that when he or she puts together your cabinets, they kind of line up and they're, perpendicular and square and all those kinds of things. Same thing kind of applies when you hire a lawyer to represent you in a court of law. You want those agents to be experts in their field. Now, the problem is that the agents may have an incentive to promote their own interests at the expense of the principal. I mean, when you bring a contractor into your home, what kind of a goal does he or she have? And that goal is to, of course, do a good job, make sure that the customer is satisfied. But somewhere along the line, there's going to be a decision to be made. And I'm going to make one up here. Let's suppose that there's a corner of your cabinets and you need this piece of wood, and the contractor could put in let's say a $10 piece of wood, or a $20 piece of wood, and you can't see it, but you might know that it's soundproof or something like that. And so there might be an incentive for the contractor to kind of cut corners, especially if the homeowner is not going to be aware that those corners are cut. Now let's go ahead and talk about some principal-agent relationships that might have some problems. What about the relationship between shareholders and managers? There are 2 potential problems here. First of all, remember the shareholders are the owners of the business. The managers are the agents that are hired by the executives. You ready for this? Executives who are hired through the board of directors for whom the shareholders vote. So let's think about this. What is the conflicting goal? Shareholders, what do they want? They want to maximize cash flows over the long term. That sounds an awful lot like maximizing shareholder wealth. But managers, on the other hand, might want to maximize their own personal wealth. So let's take a look at 2 really important people in the history of economic thought. Let's go way, way back to the olden days. Adam Smith in 1776. Remember, he decided about that invisible hand. Can you see my hand coming through there? It's not invisible, but you can see it. Adam Smith was the first to note that individuals will act in their own self-interest. And his idea of a smooth and efficient economy was that when all of these individuals are acting in their own self-interest, the invisible hand of the market forces will promote economic development. It will promote an efficient flow of capital and other resources to their most productive output. And the state of the economy depends on these individuals acting in their own self-interest. Milton Friedman, the great economist who lived and published his work in the 60s and 70s and 80s, he came up with this notion that the goal of the business is to maximize shareholder wealth. I use that term all the time. I wish I would have come up with that term, but it was, of course, somebody a lot smarter that came before I did. So think about this. What do managers have an incentive to do? They have an incentive to do things like make sure that they're paid a high salary, make sure that they get paid lots of bonuses, make sure that they consume lots of perks. Things like, new office space, things like company cars, things like helicopters, and all sorts of these extra benefits. Maybe you could call them fringe benefits. So this is clearly a problem because, remember, the shareholders are providing their hard-earned capital to the executives who are supposed to invest in positive net present value, wealth increasing projects. Now, we'll talk about how this problem is mitigated here in just a few slides. But the other part of the conflict between shareholders and managers includes a different viewpoint about riskier projects. Shareholders probably want the executives to undertake risky projects. Managers, on the other hand, are probably a little bit more risk averse because if the firm invests in risky projects and then those risky projects fail, the firm might fail, in which case the managers would lose their jobs. So in order for managers to maintain their job security, they probably prefer lower risk projects. I have a good example coming up in a few seconds. Another relationship that might be a problem is between the managers and the board of directors. And this relies almost entirely on something called information asymmetry. And this simply means that one group of people knows a different information set than another group of people. And so clearly the managers who run the business on a day-to-day basis, they're going to know intricate details about the success or failure of the product lines that are in place. Now, of course, it's the manager's job to report that to the board of directors. This happens most often. But think of the case where the manager has developed a new product line and this product line is failing. Well, there is an incentive for the manager to kind of sugarcoat it or maybe even lie to the board when reporting on that particular product line. So this may compromise the board's oversight role. There's also a conflict between the controlling and the minority shareholders. So envision a company that has 2 or 3 or 4 controlling shareholders. When they pool their shares, they have more than 51% ownership. And then there might be 1 or 2 other people that are owners, but maybe they have 5 or 10%. And those 5 or 10% minority shareholders really are silenced. And so their concerns have a tendency to be ignored. So there's a conflict between the controlling and the minority shareholders. Then there's a conflict between the shareholders and the bondholders, or the shareholders and the creditors. And here's the example that I promised you from the previous slide. Shareholders prefer high-risk projects. Managers and creditors tend to prefer a safety-first approach and prefer less risky projects. So let me give you the example of the Hershey Company. I'm sure you guys know Milton Hershey. He's been making chocolate for a long, long time. Hershey Kisses, Hershey chocolate bars. And one day about 20 years ago, the Hershey Company decided to make icebreakers. This was a tremendous departure of the low-risk Hershey Kiss product line. I mean, let's face it, if Milton Hershey wanted to manufacture, let's say, 10,000 Hershey Kisses today, what does the Hershey Company know? They could put them on the shelves of Target or Walmart tomorrow, and they know that they're going to get sold. But icebreakers, boy, what does Hershey know about icebreakers and bad breath? This was a high-risk project. Now, the cool news for Hershey is that the icebreakers has become a branded product line, and it's right alongside, in terms of cash flow and profitability, of some of their chocolate product lines. Some other conflicts: customers versus shareholders, customers and suppliers, shareholders versus government. So this principal-agent relationship and the problems that may arise because of conflicts of interest are a part of many of these relationships between and among stakeholders. All right, this LOS asks us to describe stakeholder management. So we're going to identify and prioritize and understand each stakeholder group. And so the best practice of good components of stakeholder management includes things like, notice I have some underlined terms: stakeholder rights, legally binding contracts, and infrastructure. I mean, what does this mean? If a stakeholder right is violated, For example, if a worker gets injured on the job, if there's some type of a harassment, there should be an infrastructure that allows for a process for which the injured employee can work through to be made whole again. And so when those rights are violated, then this good stakeholder management, a good corporate governance process will involve a legal infrastructure and a robust contractual infrastructure as well. Because let's go back to Thomas Jefferson a long, long time ago. Thomas Jefferson said there's no way that this republic and this free enterprise can work unless we honor contracts. So as part of an best practice for corporate governance structure, there has to be a system to enforce all of the contracts, whether it's an employee contract, whether it's a contract with a supplier, or any other type of contract that is signed by the firm. Now, organizational infrastructures and governmental infrastructures that produce things like sound internal systems and a system of controls, checks and balances, so that the outcomes are appropriate and relevant and in the best interest of the stakeholders in general. How do we manage this stakeholder relationship, and how do we mitigate the associated risks? I promised you this a few slides ago. Of course, the annual meetings. Shareholders are always invited to the annual meetings, and they can review the financial statements, and they can try to participate in the strategic plan. The board of directors, of course, these men and women are elected by the shareholders to bear the ultimate responsibility over the strategic plan of the company and the overall corporate governance. Now, within that board of directors, there's going to be an audit committee, and the responsibility of that audit committee is, of course, to complete the audit function, which is to independently review the policies and the procedures and to hire accountants so that we can put together accurate and transparent financial statements that ensure compliance with any kind of rule or regulation. We also have to concern ourselves with the employee contracts for compensation and employee contracts for benefits. There are also contracts with the creditors and the bankers and the bondholders, and so we need to make sure that those are outlined specifically and transparently. And then employee laws and contracts. All right, here's my favorite part of this reading. What about the board of directors? How do we figure out what the functions and the responsibilities of the board and its committees are? So the board of directors provides oversight, that makes sense, serves as a link, right, between shareholders and managers, and it has ultimate responsibility of ensuring that the company adopts proper corporate governance principles. That should make perfect sense. Two main responsibilities: duty of care and duty of loyalty. And what this means is that the board members must act on fully informed basis, in good faith, with due diligence and care. So that means they're going to work hard. They're going to interview the management team to make certain that they have all of the information that they need in order to make this decision. One example is in product recalls. I bet many of you guys are too young to remember when Tylenol had this big problem back in the late 70s where somebody put some cyanide in those capsules. They don't make capsules anymore because you can pull them apart and you can pour whatever you want in there. And a handful of people died, and that product was recalled immediately. And what Tylenol did was they invented, right, in response to this tragedy, terrible tragedy, by putting those sealed, the sealed paper product over top of the bottle so that you knew that it would be not tampered with when you unscrewed the cap. Because in the old days, I bet you guys don't know this, in the old days, you would open up your Tylenol or whatever kind of pill that you bought at the store, and all there would be is a cotton ball. You'd pull the cotton ball out and you'd put the medicine in your hand. But nowadays, you got to unscrew the top, you got to undo the plastic or the rubber bands or whatever they have in there. And that's all because of Tylenol in the late 70s. How about duty of loyalty? This requires members to act in the interest of the company and the shareholders. And this specifically means to avoid a conflict of interest. A good example is in takeovers. Suppose there's a board member who has a cousin or somebody who owns another firm out there, and the company on which the board member serves wants to take over this other company. And so there's a clear conflict of interest in the merger and acquisition market. All right, what are the responsibilities of the board? Guides and approves, delegates, strategy implementation, reviews corporate performance. Here's my favorite one. This is what I say all the time about the board's most important function is to hire and fire the senior executives. Leadership continuity, overall structure for the audit and control, and then they oversee the most important reports by committees. Here are the committees. An audit committee. What this does is make sure that the financial reporting process is proper and that the financial statements are accurate and transparent and reflect the mechanics and the workings of the business. The governance committee, this is a specific committee that evaluates the governance practices. There's a compensation committee that evaluates how well the firm is paying its employees, which includes benefits. I mean, if you go to the Procter & Gamble webpage, and if you look in their proxy statement, you'll see that the senior executives, as part of their benefits package, they get a home security system. They get work parking that is in a secure location. They get an annual physical. And get this, they have access to the company jet. Now, of course, there are limits that if you take your children or your spouse, you have to pay. You have to pay for them, but they still have access. Nomination committee establishes the nomination procedures and policies for replacing board members, because we don't want to have board members serve for 20 or 50 years. We want to get new people on there with new experience and new skills. Risk committee oversees formulation and implementation of a risk management framework. If you go to the Bank of New York Mellon Financial Institution webpage, they call this the Risk Appetite Committee. I think that's an interesting name. And then the investment committee. How about market factors that affect these stakeholder relationships and corporate governance? Yeah, market factors. So what can happen? Shareholders can engage through the annual meetings and through analyst calls. Shareholders can attend the annual meeting. Shareholders can become active. Each company has its own set of rules, but if you own a minimum number of shares, and some of these are as few as 100 shares, that you can put a proposal together and force the executives to put it on the proxy statement so that all shareholders get to vote on it. And I have an example here about poison pills because I wrote 1/3 of my dissertation on poison pills. So I used to know lots and lots about poison pills, but this is what I'll tell you about these things. Poison pills are an anti-takeover defense that make mergers and acquisitions more costly. And here's the kind of viewpoint that I'll share with you. I won't give you all the details about poison pills, but poison pills is the term that the financial press reports on this kind of an event. But when you look at the publications that the firm who adopts a poison pill, they will tell you it's called a shareholder rights plan. Who's not in favor of a shareholder rights plan? This is great public relations. Everybody's in favor of shareholder rights. But the rights, they're really strange. The rights give the shareholders the right to buy shares in the company at a tremendous discount in the event of a takeover. So imagine a company with 100 shares and an acquiring firm accumulates 5 of those shares. So they have 5% ownership. What those other 95 shareholders can do is they can buy shares in the company at a steep discount. If the stock price was $50 that the acquiring firm paid, maybe these other 95 shareholders can buy the shares for $5. And for every share they own, maybe they can buy 15 or 20 shares. So it's a massive flood of shares that drives stock price down to almost zero. So know No poison pill has ever been swallowed. No shareholder rights plan has ever been triggered. But the threat is real, and it has prevented lots and lots of acquisitions that are out there. So shareholders who are active, they can come to the firm and say, hey, look, we want to get rid of this poison pill, and let's put it to a shareholder vote. Other market factors include competition and takeovers, and I just mentioned that with poison pills. How about non-market factors? And this is pretty much a combination of the legal environment with the law system and all the lawyers who are there to protect the shareholders and the creditors. And then the media, of course, with social media and the financial news and the financial press. And then corporate governance has been, it's a relatively new term that shareholders are in the last 20 years are becoming aware of, but it's been around for a long, long time. But it's really now fully integrated into leadership models. Let's go through this just quickly here. Here's a corporate governance fact sheet from McDonald's. Just a couple of interesting things on here. Size of the board. So there's 11 board members at McDonald's, 10 of whom are independent. There's an annual review of independence of the board. There's a separate chairman and CEO. There's an independent chairman. There's an independent audit and finance committee. There's an independent governance committee, an independent compensation committee. There's a compensation consultant independence policy. So look at all these things down here that say yes, 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 yes. And go way down there to the bottom. What does it say? Poison pill, negative. That's kind of comical. And so what is this McDonald's corporate governance fact sheet? Just this fact sheet. You don't even have to go to the McDonald's webpage and look at the details of all these. But what we've been talking about over the last few minutes tells us that McDonald's is fully aware of the importance of corporate governance, and they're trying to develop, and they have imposed a system of corporate governance rules that looks pretty effective. All right, how about some potential risks? Poor corporate governance fosters unfairness between and among stakeholders. It increases the probability that managers are going to make poor investment decisions. It increases all sorts of risks like a legal or regulatory or reputational risk. Oh my, there's so many examples about firms who suffer reputational risk that leads them to things like, Chapter 7 or Chapter 11 or Chapter 13 bankruptcy. And there's the fourth one, raises the specter of bankruptcy. Potential rewards: improves operational efficiency, enhance control systems, improved operational and financial performance. So what that means is that it increases those future cash flows and it reduces investment risk. How about factors that are relevant to the analysis of corporate governance and stakeholder management? So economic ownership and voting control. Think of a company that is owned by 10 people and all these people are family members and friends. Well, that's concentrated ownership. And so there's really no separation of ownership and control. So the goals of the managers are the same as the goals of the owners. But when you get to these large corporations that have, literally billions of outstanding shares, when there is this great separation of ownership and control, when you have just a handful of the senior management team and then you got billions of shareholders, well, greater separation means more risk. Now, board of director representation reflects whether or not the firm believes that those board members ought to be dependent or independent. Back in the old days, and when I say old days, let's go back to the 1960s and maybe even into the 70s, most board members consisted of the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, the chief operating officer, and so there was hardly any independence back in those days. But now this dynamic board membership involves mostly independent board members, in other words, members who do not work directly for the company. And that has tremendously increased the effective of corporate governance. And then, of course, performance and compensation ought to be linked. How about the strength of shareholder rights? When shareholders have lots of rights and those rights can be exercised either through voting or becoming active through the proxy process or annual meetings. There's a relative analysis that can be done to see if those rights are strong or weak or average when compared to other companies. And then, of course, shareholders and analysts also want to consider how a manager evaluates its long-term risks in the overall assessment of the company. All right, we're down to the final LOSs here. Let's describe environmental and social considerations. This is the E and the S part of the ESG. Of course, we just spent all those recent slides on the G part. And so we're going to consider environmental, social, and governance factors in the investment process. And so now we're taking a step away. In those first bunches of slides, we were kind of looking at this as if we were one of those stakeholders in a company. Now we're going to be the investor, specifically, maybe the shareholder or the bondholder, or we're going to be a mutual fund manager or a money manager to evaluate all these different companies. And so we can rank companies based on their pollution prevention or their energy efficiency or reduced emissions or their adherence to safety and regulatory standards. I've used the example of Cheetah Marine as a company that they produce boats, and they produce boats for all types of clients. But one of the cool things about their boats is that they've developed a hydrogen-powered engine. And so the water underneath the boat is used to help power the boat. I mean, that sounds like a really cool way to combine preventing pollution, energy efficiency, and reduced emissions. And so as investment analysis, if you like these kinds of things as part of your portfolio, then a company like Cheetah Marine will probably pop up on your screen. And that's what this last LOS asks us to. How can we use screening? So there could be negative screening. So we could say something like, I don't want any company that manufactures alcohol. I can have positive screening that says something like, I want a company that puts hydrogen power into their engines. And then I can evaluate them based on their performance against a group of peers. And so the Morgan Stanley, the MSCI ratings helps do that. And that takes us through corporate governance. Next up is capital budgeting.